Thank you.
And again, for those of you who are coming to the understanding of what's happening, this is a Fox News alert. Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia has died at the age of 79. One of our top correspondents in the D.C. Bureau, James Rosen, who has followed the Supreme Court as well, now on the line with us to share some of his insights into the passing of Justice Scalia. And James, we've heard from Arthur Aidala, who has been a very personal friend to the Justice, Laura Ingraham as well. And while many people may have criticized him for some of the things that took place on the court that he was, in terms of his decisions, what we are finding out that hands down, he was a man's man and the kind of man who believed in family as being the core value of America. And certainly people would be hard pressed to disagree with that. James?
Well, Kelly, of course, our condolences are with the Scalia family at this time. I wouldn't pretend to be expert in Justice Scalia's jurisprudence, the decisions he wrote, his dissents, the concrete impact of his rulings on the way we live our lives as Americans. I would leave that to those who covered the Supreme Court consistently, which I never did. However, I was privileged to observe Justice Scalia up close in different settings, one of which was the Supreme Court during oral arguments that I covered from time to time as a reporter, the other of which was the AV Ristorante on New York Avenue, now closed, but for 40-odd years, the Justice's favorite and regular lunchtime spot, an Italian place, as its name suggested, and where we dined together for lunch, just the two of us, on a couple of occasions, and after which, on one occasion, Justice Scalia actually gave me a ride back to Fox News with me as the passenger in his car and him behind the wheel, and not utterly immune to road rage, I would say. We also enjoyed a lively correspondence for a time. In terms of the oral arguments that I observed, Justice Scalia was usually the liveliest of the several justices who were given to peppering the attorneys during oral arguments. In addition to a genius legal mind, Scalia possessed I would say, a devilish sense of humor and a certain instinct for mischief. All of these traits standing quite apart from his judicial philosophy, which championed textualism, the idea that only the text of a law should be considered by judges when interpreting statutes, not the legislative history or foreign case law and so on. And these traits also stood apart from the political outlook that Scalia could be discerned as harboring. I remember one case, not one of the ones I attended, where the issue at hand had to do with accommodations for disabled golfers and how far that should be taken in competitive situations. And Justice Scalia posed the question of whether, if that accommodation were granted, henceforth little leaguers meeting certain standards would be granted a fourth strike at the plate. That was just the kind of needling wit that he brought to these affairs. Scalia is also reputed to have authored the shortest and therefore the most direct sentence in the history of Supreme Court case law. Quote, context matters. And that was also, I think, very much like him. The lunches that I had with him, Kelly, were wide-ranging affairs during which, in the comfort of the protection of our lunches being off the record, he sounded off to me on a number of events and personalities, both immediate and historical interest, ranging from Richard Nixon to George W. Bush to Anita Hill and Clarence Thomas. And I'm sure when the moment is more appropriate, I'll share some of that with the world, because it was fascinating stuff and often very surprising.
You know, I'm looking at some of his quotes, James, and because of the fact that you've had lunch with him and you may have been able to hear and glean from his sense of purpose, his sense of humor as well. But one quote here is, "I don't assess the nation's mood. I assess my own, and I'm feeling good." Those are remarks that he made at the Columbus Citizens Foundation dinner, October 8th, 2005. And he said he was especially proud of his writing and legal reasoning in this opinion. Frequently, an issue of this sort will come before the court clad, so to speak, in sheep's clothing. And he wanted to say the potential of the asserted principle to effect important change in the equilibrium of power is not immediately evident and must be discerned by a careful and perspective analysis, but this wolf comes as a wolf. That was his dissent in Morrison versus Olson, but going back to 1988. There's so many quotes from this man who was a brilliant legal mind.
And the longest serving
justice on the court. We do have a statement coming in now from Chief Justice Roberts, at least part of it. He's saying, on behalf of the court and retired justices, I'm saddened to report that our colleague, Justice Antonin Scalia, has passed away. And then he goes on to say that Justice Scalia was an extraordinary individual and jurist, admired and treasured by his colleagues. Just the beginning of several statements and comments that will continue to come in this evening.
You know, James, when you look at Washington and the fact that Washington in and of itself can be a different place, totally foreign to many Americans who live out in other parts where there's smaller cities or cities that are just trying to make their own mark in sustaining their American values and their American lifestyle. In Washington, it gets to be a blood sport even when it comes down to the Supreme Court. Looking forward, as we talk to Shannon Bream, President Obama will have to come up with a nominee. And then he will likely face some blowback or criticism from the right that will probably try to make sure that the president picks someone that they believe will be conservative. The president has his own opinions and how he wants to proceed. What kind of fight are we possibly looking at to replace this Supreme Court justice?
Well, we shouldn't really expect that President Obama will have much of his ear directed at what the right will want in this process. I think that for the president, this is an unexpected and rather potent opportunity for him to add to his presidential legacy in the final year of his administration. Supreme Court nominations in general are to official Washington what a new home is to a couple, in a sense. You only get to decorate it very few times, right? And so a lot of attention is paid to this, and a lot of resources are invested in it. It only comes around once or twice, typically in 10 years or so. And so we can expect that this will be a pitched battle for the president, of course. He's going to approach it with majority control of the House and the Senate in Republican hands. But so we will see a real spectacle going forward. But I would imagine that President Obama will try to use this opportunity to extend and to implement those aspects of his policies, perhaps, that he has not been able to do or accomplish in, say, the legislative vehicle.
You know, you look back at the State of the Union address and some of the opinions expressed when some members of the Supreme Court did not show up when the president was giving a State of the Union address. I'm sorry, I'm at a loss for the year that took place, but it was something that really shocked a lot of people in Washington as well. And Washington is sometimes above being shocked by any situation. But this
I think Washington is below being shocked, Kelly. But look, there's no question that the Supreme Court from time to time is seen to be political. Certainly it's a political process, as in direct elections or the Electoral College that produces presidents who nominate Supreme Court justices. But nonetheless, for many, many years, the Supreme Court occupied a place where it was hallowed and where it was considered the marble temple. In more recent decades, particularly with the publication of certain books, including memoirs by certain clerks to Supreme Court justices, we've gotten a more intimate glimpse of how the Supreme Court really works. Personalities come into play, and so does politics. Justice Scalia's critics would say of him that while he championed textualism, this idea that only the text of the law should matter, he himself seemed to use that theory to arrive at decisions that invariably favored one political philosophy, which was conservatism.
Conservatives.
But nonetheless, I can just say again from my personal experience with the man, which is what I think we should be remembering at this time, is the man. He was a very down-to-earth guy. And at one point in our lunches, Justice Scalia insisted that I eat vegetables off of his plate. And, of course, I demurred, and he insisted. And there was no resisting his force of nature at that point, and I did so. And on another occasion, when he had finished ordering his meal, delivering that to the waiter, and I was in mid-sentence ordering mine, Justice Scalia interrupted and instructed the waiter to bring me a certain dish, which I won't name here, but which was one I have never had, chiefly for the reason that I find it repulsive. And again, there was no denying the man, and I had to endure eating the dish while keeping up my end of our conversation. And I want you to know that I later informed Justice Scalia that I considered that act on his part in that instance as that he had been guilty of judicial activism.
James, well said, as only James Rosen can do. But like